Hey guys, Dan here again. Today I want to talk about reducing the risk for arm injuries because obviously with throwing sports or any sort of rotating of the arm sports where you have to do it a lot of times, it's an inherent increase in risk of arm, shoulder, elbow injuries, things like that, which I'm sure you may have experienced yourself or know people who have experienced. If you've been playing any amount of time, you know that happens. And so really, there's a lot of reasons an injury can happen, but one of them, and a lot of this stuff is parallels between a lot of other things that we do. For example, like you'll see the same things in sprinting and lifting weights, which is a lot of what my background's in. And really it comes down to managing people's bodies and their physiology to ensure that they're getting a ton out of what they're training for, but that they're also not increasing their risk for injuring themselves by doing too much. And one of the most common ways that people get hurt in any sort of activity, really, and you see it in running a lot as an example, is doing too much too soon and being underprepared to handle how much you're trying to do. Because you can't go out there and throw 50 pitches at 100 miles an hour at 100% if you've done no throwing leading up to that point. That's a great recipe for increasing your chances for injury. You might not get hurt. So that's why we talk in manner that says you increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood, because you really can't prevent injury, 100%. There's always that risk. And so really what it comes down to is building a tolerance to be able to handle more intense training. So for example, if you want to get faster, sprinting is an excellent way, super simple, super fundamental way of improving your power and your speed output as an athlete in general, not just in running, but also in here in the baseball and softball setting. And so there's a famous track coach who helped Ben Johnson win an Olympic gold medal back in the day named Charlie Francis. And what he would do is, obviously, if you want to get really good at sprinting, you have to sprint all the time. But you can't do that, like I said, if you're underprepared to do that sort of workload. So he would have people sprint, and keep them at a workload. For example, maybe 5 sprints on day 1. Not a ton, but enough to get a stimulus out of it. But then on opposing days, he would do really kind of not full out sprints and not even medium runs, but like 70 or 60% and below of what their top speed would be. And he'd do a lot of things called tempo runs, which is just like running 50 yards, walking 50 yards, or running 100 yards, walking 100 yards, just kind of aerobic sort of training, nothing too intense. But what it did is it gradually increased the amount of work they were doing at lower intensities, but they were increasing the amount of work that they could do. So after a few weeks of maybe doing 5 sprints every other day with those tempo runs in between, 2-3 weeks later, maybe they're doing 6 or 7 sprints with those tempo runs in between. So those tempo runs, or those low intensity runs, help increase the amount of work that an athlete can handle. And so those sprinters were able to increase the amount of sprint reps they could do with a lower risk of injury because their body was built up to handle a lot of sprinting. So if you think about that from a baseball or softball standpoint, I see parallels right off the bat. Lower intensity throwing, easy tossing, some light long toss, things like that. Not going all out, not trying to throw it as far as you can. Doing light throwing will increase the amount of work that your arm can handle. So for example, if you start long tossing, preseason's coming up, in early, late winter, early spring, and instead of going out there and doing 50 throws as hard as you possibly can, as far as you can, maybe you just do a few, 5 to 10 of those, and then you back off, you move in closer, you throw less hard, or you decrease your speed, and you're a little bit easier, maybe 60 or 70% and below of how hard you could actually throw. And you do that for maybe 5-10 minutes. And then the next week you go out and maybe you throw 8 to 12 really hard ones. And then maybe you're throwing nice and easy for 6 to 12 minutes. So you see what I mean here is you do high intensity stuff at lower amounts while you build the lower intensity stuff or lower intensity throwing. And as you build that workload or that capacity that you can handle for throwing, you can increase the amount of hard throws that you can handle. And so that means that you're prepared to handle a higher intensity. So you reduce the risk of doing too much too soon because you spent the time building up your arm and building up your work capacity. And not to mention, doing a lot of throwing, even light throwing, all of that stuff accumulates, and it's going to help your arm strength, your endurance, and once again, reduce the risk or the likelihood of you getting hurt from doing too much too soon. And I just wanted to give a couple tips on reducing the risk for arm injuries.